This is being recorded. It is also being live streamed. And then please, just to help with the conversation, let's use the raise hand function before speaking. In the bottom section, there's a little smiley face that says reactions. If you click on that, you'll see a raise hand. So just go ahead and click on that and we'll get questions. We got a pretty full evening tonight. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce, oh, wait. 1 second, before I do that, we have a member who has not been able to join us before this evening, Ms. Dolly Specht. So I was going to let Dolly introduce herself. If you wouldn't mind just sharing your name, if you feel comfortable, your pronouns, and a little bit about why you wanted to be on this committee.
Hello, my first time to attend, but I'm Dolly Specht, lived in Tigard, she, her is my pronouns, are my pronouns. I've lived in Tigard for over 34 years. I am currently serving as the vice chair for the Committee for Community Engagement for the city, and I'm on the steering committee of CPO4M. And since I made a decision that this is my forever home, raising my grandkids here too. I'm very well vested and more committed than ever to serve my city and my neighborhood and my community. And that's why I raised my hand for this as well.
Thank you, Dolly. And now I will turn it over to Elaine Howard, who is joining us this evening. She's going to do a presentation on urban renewal. There are a couple breaks in her presentation for questions, so if you wouldn't mind just holding them until those. And I'll share your presentation. Just tell me the next slides.
Great, thank you. My name's Elaine Howard. I've worked with Tigard for, gosh, about 15 years on different urban renewal issues over those years. So I know Tigard well and know your plans well. Actually wrote the Tigard Triangle Plan and have done a couple of amendments on the Tigard Downtown Plan. Hear me okay? I see someone kind of moving towards the screen. Okay. So what I will review tonight are the basics of urban renewal or tax increment financing. Urban renewal and tax increment financing are interchangeable. Some cities are changing their terminology from urban renewal to tax increment because they think urban renewal has negative connotations and they would rather use the terminology tax increment financing. So if you hear and see both terms, they both mean those same provisions that I'll talk about in a minute. And then I will review other cities with specific charter provisions, and then just some considerations for you as your charter committee to think about. Next slide. This is a little animation on how urban renewal works. So when we all pay our property taxes in November, those property taxes go to the county assessor, who then doles them out to the different taxing jurisdictions. Those are the city, the county, the 4-H, the schools, although the schools are funded through the state school fund, so they're a little bit different. Those property tax revenues go up in Oregon for only 2 reasons. One is our property taxes are allowed to increase by 3% per year. There's a limitation on that. So if we do nothing to do substantial improvements on our properties, we will normally see our property tax bill go up by 3% every year. The other way a property tax bill can go up is either substantial improvements or new construction that happens on the property. So if you do substantial improvements, usually something that costs over about $25,000, the assessor is allowed to reassess your property and to change what your total property assessment is, and then you pay taxes on that reassessment. Next slide. When an urban renewal area is formed within a city, the tax assessor calculates what the total assessed value of that urban renewal area is. That's shown in the blue in this little animation. So the rest of the city's taxes continue going to all of the different taxing districts, just like they used to. But for that urban renewal area, they now go through a process called division of taxes. Next slide, please. That division of taxes means for every year that the urban renewal area is functioning, those increases in property tax revenue in that area over the amount that it was when the area was formed all go to the Urban Renewal Agency to do projects, programs, and pay for administration of that area. So that is for the full permanent rate levy. It's not just for the city's levy. It's for the full permanent rate levy. So for all of the different taxing jurisdictions, any increase in value within that area, they no longer receive. That money goes to the Urban Renewal Agency to pay for projects, programs, and administration within that area. Next slide. This just shows that in a little different concept. This shows that when an urban renewal area is established, the assessor establishes a frozen base assessed value. So that's the total assessed value of that urban renewal area. So just that area in blue on the prior slide. And all the taxing jurisdictions continue receiving their taxes off of that. They, of course, continue receiving their taxes off of all other property within the city that's outside of the urban renewal area. Over the time frame of an urban renewal area, which is typically 25 to 30 years, those property taxes increase, and that increase is called increment. And that increment, shown in blue here, goes to the Urban Renewal Agency to be able to do those projects and programs within that area. Many times those projects are completed prior to paying off the costs of the projects, because the city will typically issue some kind of bond or have some kind of long-term debt that funds those projects. So if they take out a bond that is paid for with the tax increment revenues, they have to continue taking those tax increment revenues until that bond is fully paid off. Once the bond is paid off, the urban renewal area expires, and all of the increased value due to projects that have happened within that urban renewal area is then reallocated to the full tax roll, and the different taxing jurisdictions receive the benefit of that increased value over that time period. And that, let's see, one more slide, and then I'll stop for questions. So the important things to know about urban renewal financing is, number one, we don't pay as property owners additional taxes due to the taxes of urban renewal. The property taxes that go to urban renewal come from the different taxing districts, not from the individual property owners. Schools are indirectly impacted by urban renewal because they are funded through the state school fund on a per pupil basis. That means they get a set amount of money for every student who is in the schools. And that set amount of money varies a little bit in each school district, but it is according to a specific formula that equalizes funding across the state. Urban renewal impacts the state school fund overall, but there are other resources that the legislature is able to tap to backfill those losses from the permanent rate taxes that go to urban renewal. If you live in a city that has an urban renewal area, even though you're not within that area, there is a line item on your property tax bill that says urban renewal. So if you all live within the city limits of Tigard, and if you own property and you look back at your property tax bill, there is a line item that says urban renewal. If urban renewal goes away, if for some reason Tigard shut down both of their urban renewal areas, you would not pay fewer taxes. You would pay the same amount of taxes, but those taxes would be redistributed to those taxing districts that were foregoing that revenue. So your individual property tax bill does not go up by urban renewal. And also, if urban renewal ends, it does not go down. In Tigard and in most cities now, there are no general obligation bonds or local option levies impacted by any urban renewal plan. Some of the older urban renewal plans did have impacts on general obligation bonds that the city had or on local option levies. School districts typically will have some kind of a local option levy, but neither of your districts have those impacts anymore. So at this point, I'll stop and just make sure people understand the concept of urban renewal. And I guess also that you have two urban renewal areas in Tigard. You have the downtown area and you have an area around the Tigard Triangle, which is a relatively new area.
Yes, Margaret, I see your hand.
This is the one question I have, and so this is just as a clarification. So when the urban renewal area is finished, like for example, all of the apartments in the triangle, when that's all completed and that kind of thing, then the revenues that come from property taxes through those property taxes go back into the Tigard coffers. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Yeah. Okay.
When the whole area closes down.
Yeah. So it's almost like we loan money, but we get it back.
Correct.
Okay. Thank you.
And Carol, please. Oh, Carol, you're muted.
There. Do other cities have more than one? Is it common to have like several?
The bigger cities do, yes. And you're classified as one of the bigger cities. So
Okay.
Tualatin right now has 3, I think. Oh, I don't know how many Beaverton has. Portland has many. Salem has about 9. Wilsonville has 5 or 5. So yeah, it's common for the larger cities to have more than one area.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. And Zena, please.
So my question is, do the property taxes increase by 3% every year on top of the TIF tax?
No, that 3%, that TIF tax, that TIF tax is, if you're in an urban renewal area, that 3% is the TIF tax. So there's no increase on top of that. It just becomes that TIF tax if you're in the urban renewal area.
Otherwise, it is 3%.
Otherwise, across all of Oregon, our property taxes, our assessed values and property taxes, unless we're in a huge recession, will go up by 3% a year.
Okay. So is there a upper limit on the TIF tax percentage increase?
It's the same. It's the same. It is the 3%, unless there is unless there are substantial improvements or new construction.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. And Zachary, please.
So would the new urban renewal financing work as more of like an added tax based on the true value of the property, or because you said something about the value of?
Yeah, it is not an added tax. So it is just a division of taxes that we already pay. So if you're in an urban renewal area, from the time that it's formed, any increases in your taxes, either from that 3%, or if you do substantial improvements or new construction, that increase, whether or not you have urban renewal, it will increase. If you have urban renewal, that amount goes to the urban renewal agency. So it's not an added tax. It's not a new tax. It's a division of the taxes that you would already pay.
Thank you, Elaine. And Karen, please.
I wanted to make a comment about Margaret's question, because I don't think what she asked is true. because your question was, do we loan it and then get it paid back? And what we're looking at on the screen, that whole like blue triangle, that is spent, and the city does not get that back at the end of the project.
I understand there may be a different interpretation of getting it back. So let me clarify what I thought. They get the value of that property back to the regular tax rolls. So yes, you're right, that all that blue gets spent within the urban renewal area, and you never get that money back, but you get that property back on the regular tax rolls once an area ends. So thank you for letting me clarify that.
And Elaine, that's represented by the gray column on the right side of this chart.
That's correct.
Margaret, did you have a comment?
Well, it's more of a comment, because that was what I understood, is the idea that you invest money, but eventually we get the money back because they're put on the tax rolls and that kind of thing. So, and I know when you talk about the different ones, this is where many times with urban renewal districts, the fire district and the schools are not always that keen on it, because sometimes it takes some funds away from those two entities when it comes to assessments and that kind of thing.
So let me clarify that. Schools, many, many years ago, used to be impacted by urban renewal.
Big time.
Since the state school fund was established, we now call that an indirect impact, because the state school fund is funded on that per pupil basis, and they have access to other funding sources to make up for money that doesn't come in from urban renewal. So school districts typically don't oppose urban renewal anymore because of that state school fund. But you're right, fire districts typically like TVF&R, Tualatin Valley Fire and Rescue is your fire district. They are always very interested in urban renewal. I have many times had them support it, but they are very interested in the types of projects that you're doing and trying to make sure that they fit the types of projects that they would prefer are done with urban renewal.
Thank you. And John, please.
Two comments, sorry, not a question. Number one is, I don't think we really covered why a city would want to do urban renewal. And so I think that the key thing here is the increment. So if you go along and do nothing we'll take Main Street to start with, and we'll cover the triangle for a second. But if you do nothing to improve the area on Main Street, it will become a rundown place that nobody wants to rent, and the owners of those places do not want to upgrade or upkeep. Therefore, their rent doesn't increase. Therefore, sales of those buildings don't increase. So yes, property taxes go up by 3%, but you don't really see any jump in the increment anywhere. So the idea of having a tax increment area or urban renewal is you try and jumpstart that area, because to qualify, usually it's called a blighted area. And so it's an area that you're taking that isn't going to grow on its own, and you try and jumpstart it. So the idea is, yes, you take funds away for a short period of time. Short can vary, depending on definition or how long the bonds are. It could be 5 years, could be 30 years. But that wouldn't have grown anyway. So the idea is you then jumpstart that, and then now look at your increment there. Now it's a $10 million on the gray, when if you left it alone, it might have gone from 2 maybe to 3. If you were lucky, it went to 4, but it would have never gone to 10. So the idea of the reason you do it is to get that increment. So I think that's one area we really haven't covered, is why would you even do this? Number two is an area like the triangle, where maybe you had some residential and you had some big box stores, but you didn't have anything else. You didn't have housing, in low-income housing. You didn't have multi-story housing. You didn't have roads. You didn't, to connect everything together. You didn't have creeks or stormwater runoff issues, paths. So the idea there was, if you start it before it even starts, your increment is great, because then you spend your money on infrastructure to get those started. Then you let the businesses or, the economy come in and actually do the building, that increases your increment on its own. So you could let it sit there for 30 years and it might build out on its own, but your chances of it actually happening is jump started if you do that. Sorry to talk a lot, but the only other area I really want to talk about is why Tigard even has a vote on urban renewal to start with. The majority of the
John, can we hold that particular topic until after the presentation on urban renewal?
We can, as long as we cover it before we cover discussion on it.
I will call on you first for discussion.
All right, thanks.
Yep. Thank you. And Jason, please.
I think John made most of the points I was going to make, but I just think it's really important when the explanation of why you do it wasn't included to begin with, and then this confusion between Karen's clarification and Margaret's question and the answers. Like, the reason we do it is because after making this short-term painful investment that might affect TVF&R, you come out with something much greater than you ever would have had otherwise. That is why we do it. That is the goal. And I think John covered those points and kind of illustrated the 2 to 3 million on this example on the slide on the screen versus 10 million. And while there's some short-term pain, districts like TVF&R have actually, once they understand what we're trying to accomplish, like Elaine was talking about, they're generally supportive. They were supportive of the triangle and a number of things we've done in the triangle. Where their headquarters is now, they care a lot about that area. And there's now a fairly significant, I would say, construction boom happening in the Tigard Triangle that if we hadn't taken 3 or 4 different actions as a city, urban renewal being one of them, probably wouldn't be looking the way it does now.
Thank you, Jason. Any other questions about this first half of the presentation? Otherwise, I'll turn it back to Elaine. Okay. Oh, I guess 1 second. Zachary, please.
So basically, like on the property, as time goes on, you do an adjusted property tax on the value of it. Is that what urban renewal is? Or is it more of like, because I mean, I think I kind of understand, but I don't fully what.
Okay. So when I own a piece of property, every October I get a bill from the assessor. And that bill from the assessor gets adjusted every year. And the assessor can increase the assessed value. That's the value on which I pay my taxes by 3% every year. And he or she can increase it by more if I do a substantial improvement or if I do new construction on my property. That is just how property taxes in Oregon work. If you're in an urban renewal area and those adjustments come annually, those adjustments that would have happened anyway go to the urban renewal agency to use that money instead of going to the different taxing districts. So if I pay my taxes and my value went up by 3%, that 3%, if that's just this year, the first year, goes to that urban renewal agency to use instead of to the county to use or the city of Tigard to use or another taxing district to use. So it's dividing that revenue stream of taxes a different way than it would be divided if you didn't have urban renewal. Does that help? It's really complicated, and that's why you have so many questions. And it's and that is one of the reasons why having people vote on urban renewal is so difficult, because you have to make sure people really understand what it is urban renewal does in your community.
Thank you. And Jeanette, please.
Thank you, Elaine. This is a great presentation, and I'm lucky enough to have had experienced it a couple of times now. I'm wondering if it wouldn't help if you had an example of just what a property tax looks like, and like maybe, 3 or 4 years, just hypothetical, here's a house, here's 3% it goes up without substantial improvement or new construction, and maybe even have one example of here's new construction, just so people can visually see it. I've seen that done before in another city, in another state, and it seemed to help answer some questions as well. But just
I appreciate that comment. I do have that. I was just told to give the basics, and so I didn't include that in this presentation. So if we get to the end and you want me to find that, I just presented that to the city council a week ago with that information. So so yes, that is helpful. It does help explain.
Thank you. And Margaret, please.
Hopefully one last question. I'm sorry I'm asking some others, but kind of as a clarification. So what it means is really when you've got an urban renewal district, it's not that the voters have said that there's going to be an increase in taxes because of that. It's just that the increase, which we can do up to the 3% and based on how much your property is worth and that kind of thing, it's just divided in a different manner.
That's correct.
Okay, and the reason
Temporarily.
is a lot of times Tigard doesn't want, I mean, we are really good about sending things to the voters and being really transparent as to what is going to go for when we ask for increases. But there really is no increase, it's just a different division of where the money goes.
Right, and I think, and Shelby, you can help me on this. And then it's I think one of the cities I've worked with has a vote. Their first title on the ballot title was no new taxes or no new property taxes. Yeah, John nodding. Yeah, I thought that was you. Because that is what people are most concerned with is, are you increasing my taxes? And no, urban renewal does not increase your taxes, but it does, when we talk about being transparent, it does take money away from other taxing districts. Hopefully, as John was saying, in the long run, and certainly you can see this happening in the Tigard Triangle where there's been amazing construction, they will get more taxes than they ever would have gotten if you didn't have the urban renewal area, because none of that development would have happened if you at the pace that it's happening and at the density that it's happening if you didn't have urban renewal.
All right, I think we can move on to talk about some other cities and what their charters look like.
Great. So I am also working with the city of Gresham right now on reviewing their charter, because they have, Gresham has, yeah, this should be switched. And I think Shelby asked me about that at one point, and what's happened here? There you go. Who's doing that? You are great. Kim, did you do that?
I did.
Gresham, you have to vote on any new urban renewal plan. You have to vote on any substantial amendment, and a substantial amendment is both defined by statute, and some cities further define it and make it more restrictive. So a substantial amendment is whenever you increase your maximum indebtedness or you add acreage over 1% of your original acreage. In Gresham, you have to vote on any new project, and you have to vote on anything new unless it was a typographical error in their plan. So they have the most restrictive in the state of Oregon. I met with them last week, and city council authorized staff to come to them with a potential charter amendment to, and when we get through to the definitions of options, I'll tell you which one that they're looking at. So in Tigard, you have to vote on a new urban renewal plan. You have to vote on a substantial amendment, and then I'm going to have a couple of other slides that go into a couple of other And Shelby, I think, can jump in. A couple of other issues that have been issues of concern in Tigard about when do you have to vote and when don't you have to vote, and it's kind of tied around some verbiage about tax increment financing and bond financing that's in both in your charter, and that was in one of your ballot measures language. In Corvallis, you have to vote on a new urban renewal plan and also on a substantial amendment. And in Beaverton, you have to vote on a new plan and on a substantial amendment. So of cities your size, these are the ones that require votes. So Salem does not require votes. Eugene does not require votes. Wilsonville has advisory votes, but they are not binding votes. In your kind of neighborhood, Tualatin does not require votes and Sherwood does not require votes. Next slide. So there used to be a section 45 in your charter that basically said you couldn't do urban renewal. And then there was a section 46 that says that you could amend that section 45 of the charter, that you could create or reactivate your urban renewal agency or areas. Next slide. And then there's a section in your charter that says the city shall not approve an urban renewal plan or amendment that initiates the use of tax increment financing as a permissible method of paying the debts and obligations of the agency unless prior to the activation and implementation of such tax increment financing, such method is approved by the voters of the city at a regular or special city election held in May or November. And then it talks about the central city plan being approved, and somehow I don't have the part of that charter that deals with your Tigard Triangle, but it also was approved fairly heartily by your voters. Next slide. And then section 48 says, any urban renewal plan or amendment thereof hereafter proposed or adopted shall require that the plan, including the method of financing, shall be approved by the voters. If such plan or amendment permits the city or the agency to impose additional property taxes on properties outside the urban renewal area to pay the debts or obligations to be incurred in carrying out the plan. Notwithstanding the foregoing, separate approval at an election is not required for expenditures by the city as distinguished from the urban renewal agency and issuance of Bancroft bonds in connection with assessments for local improvement districts, and then some more. So your charter doesn't simply say approving a plan or improving an amendment. It has this other language in it that can be difficult to interpret and difficult to understand. And here it might, Shelby has had to deal with these issues a number of times. So Shelby, do you want to jump in and explain part of that difficulty?
You know, I think for this group, like we've talked about before, if it's something that requires constant interpretation by city council and attorneys, that it's not something we want in the charter. So I think instead of trying to, because I don't remember exactly how we hashed out the language before, I think I've blocked that from my memory. So I guess for purposes of this presentation, what would be helpful is kind of looking prospectively at what we think is a good way to approach tax increment financing and urban renewal, and with an understanding that if it requires clarification and interpretation, that presents risk for the city, and that's what we want to avoid.
So the underlying portion of this on if such plan or amendment permits the city or the agency to impose additional, that can be misconstrued and misunderstood in a wide variety of ways. And so that language is difficult because you have to interpret what does that really mean? And does the way we do tax increment financing really pertain anymore because it's changed to this. So next slide. Other than the larger cities, and there are a handful of smaller cities, well, Oregon City has a very restrictive charter on urban renewal. And then in Clackamas County, in unincorporated areas, you must have a vote on urban renewal. But otherwise, across the state, most urban renewal areas match the requirements of ORS 457, which does not require a vote of the people, either for a plan or for any amendments. ORS 457 allows the city council to form an urban renewal area on its own after a public process, which includes consulting and conferring with the taxing districts. It includes a citywide notice for a public hearing, which that citywide notice has to go to either voters, residents, utility customers, postal patrons, one of those 4 groups, for a public hearing on the adoption of the ordinance. So it is a well-known fact that the city will be looking at that. The vast majority of the plans in Oregon use those provisions. There is what's called a tax increment finance best practices manual that a group of tax increment agencies, and Tigard is one of those, have put together. And it has no recommendation for charter provisions for votes. So it doesn't say they think it's a good idea. It doesn't have any recommendation. It doesn't say it isn't a good idea. It just leaves that issue out. They don't make any recommendation on it. And I am going to look and see where I am. I have one more slide and then we'll take questions. Is that okay? Okay. So considerations of some simple options. If you mirror ORS 457, which is the Oregon revised statute that covers how urban renewal works in Oregon, you would have your plan approved by city council. It would not be referred to voters. Any substantial amendment to increase acreage would be approved by city council. It's not referred to voters. That's called a substantial amendment. Any substantial amendment to increase the maximum indebtedness would be approved by city council. It would not be referred to voters. If you wanted to look at changing the charter in a less in a different manner, where you kept that requirement for a plan vote or a substantial amendment vote, then the plan would be referred to the voters, the amendment, a substantial amendment to increase acreage and to increase the maximum indebtedness would be approved by voters. And again, there's a handful of cities that decide that they want to do that, and the majority do not. So those are just considerations of options. And I think I did not know and do not have the information about why you have this charter amendment in the first place. So that information might be good before we go to other questions.
Read my mind. John, please take it away.
All right, thank you. This actually became into effect in September of 1983. If you look at your chart of elections that Kim sent out to us before, Tigard, like the majority of cities that she spoke about, could and did have an urban renewal before that. So Tigard had urban renewal. In fact, as she just stated, the majority of the cities, there's 241 cities in Oregon, and less than 10% of them actually require a vote of some type regarding urban renewal. And if you look at the voting that happened that Kim sent out, all of the urban renewal votes in Tigard have been pretty much 2/3, 1/3. And we'll get into that when later on when we talk about discussion, but I just wanted to make that as a point. So why in 1983 did this come about? Tigard had urban renewal, and why did the citizens come forward and say, we want to vote? It wasn't the city council that said we want to do that. The citizens did a referral. The reason is the urban renewal area at the time included Main Street, and where Main Street Village Apartments are, there was a developer coming forward to develop a strip mall, sort of like the Albertsons was at the other end where McDonald's is, and they wanted to have a matching one at both ends of Main Street. Therefore, the city thought that was a good idea, and the city council was pushing that forward. The problem is once the citizens found out that the person running that project was the son of the mayor, the citizens were not real happy. And so the citizens did a referral and said, okay, we want to vote on that if it's going to happen. And so that's what required it. So if you look at Oregon City, you look at, Beaverton, why they require votes, it's usually because something happened along the way. It's not because citizen says, oh, I trust everybody, therefore we should be fine. It's because something happened. And so since that happened, bless you. I think a lot of things have changed in those 40 years. And so I don't think the same thing can happen. The ethics laws in Oregon, and Jason will talk a lot about this, they're the strongest of any state in the nation. It's not even close, of what the commissioners and counselors have to abide by. So I don't even see this happening today, but it's what happened in 1983. And so because of that happening, that's why Tigard became a vote for that. So it was my dad's last year on the council. The next year he was the mayor. So he was involved in that, but it was related to the mayor at the time in 83.
Thank you, John, for that important context. And then Tony, you had your hand up first. Oh, you're still muted, Tony.
Can you hear me okay? I'm using different equipment.
You're good.
Perfect, thank you. On the previous slide on the presentation where it mentioned when we were talking about the financing, I had a question about, and this is kind of context for the financing. It looked like typically the urban renewal boundary is what sets whose TIF funds go towards the urban renewal project itself. So people outside of that zone aren't paying into the urban renewal project. Was I reading that correctly? And then the other piece was after that, there was a environment where people who are outside of that zone, their taxes would go to improve an urban renewal zone that they may not live in. And that's sometimes where you get contention where people who are paying for benefits that they don't see in their area, then you get that kind of conflict. People tend not to want to spend money to put art in a place that they don't live. And there's a point of contention. I'm not saying that people don't pay for art in places they live, but that's generally where you get some of that pushback. So that's kind of what my question was. Is this boundary of the urban renewal zone going to be the boundary of who's paying for the urban renewal in this structure? Is that making any sense?
Blaine, yes, please.
That's a great question, and it's another one of the crazy intricacies of urban renewal. So the amount of money that the assessor allocates to the urban renewal area each year comes from the calculation of the increased value within that urban renewal area itself. However, that is then distributed to all property tax bills of all property taxpayers within the entire city. So remember I said on one of the slides, if you live in Tigard, you will have urban renewal on your property tax bill. The reason for that is the limitations of measures 47 and 50, which limited the amount of property taxes to $10 per thousand of general government, $5 per thousand for education, and made those adjustments. So after that happened, Shiloh Inns sued the city of Portland and the Portland Development Commission and said urban renewal has to be figured into one of those different categories. And so the Department of Revenue and the assessors got together and tried to figure out what to do so that it would conform with or comply with those measures. And that is how they came up with that division of taxes that spread it to every single property tax bill within the city. So it's confusing. And I have like a half-hour presentation on that too, but we can take up all our time looking at all the different presentations. But indeed, if you live outside of the Tigard Triangle, you still are paying on your property tax bill. But if that goes away, your property tax bill does not decrease. That money goes back to the different taxing districts because of that division of taxes from them. It doesn't come directly from you. So you're not really paying for it, even though it's on your property tax bill. And that is very confusing.
Thank you, Elaine. And Tony, does that clarify your question?
Yeah, and then I also had a little bit of a question about what John brought up, but I can address that later if there's a more appropriate.
Great. Thanks, Tony. And Lindsay, please.
Thank you. Thanks, Elaine, for your presentation. That was helpful. And this is going a little bit back to what John was talking about, because that context was really helpful. My question was, if so few cities in Oregon have these restrictions, it kind of begs the question, what happened in these cities where the citizens decided they needed a referral and to add these extra safeguards? So that is a helpful context with Tigard. And I guess I'm wondering, John, you talked a little bit about the ethics being a lot stronger than maybe they were in the 80s. Is ORS 457, I think it was, right, Elaine? Does that have more safeguards in it than maybe it used to? Or, what do we tell the citizens of Tigard if we say, oh, we took out that language that may be construed as like actually adding safeguards and we took it away? Just kind of thinking through that explanation if we were having that conversation with someone. So I don't know who that question should go to, but just kind of general.
I'll go to Elaine, and you don't have to raise your hand, Elaine. You're always going to answer the questions.
Okay. I'll take a little bit of that, which is any new urban renewal plan or substantial amendment has to be approved through a non-emergency ordinance. A non-emergency ordinance does not go into effect for 30 days after passage to allow citizens to take it to a referral. So if you got rid of the charter provisions for a vote on the plan or vote on the amendment, and then the city council decided to do something wild that the citizens didn't like in a plan or an amendment, they could put it on the ballot and vote again. So that is a safeguard that you have to say, okay, if something weird happens here that we don't like, do we still have the ability to do something, through our vote? And ORS 457, it's changed over the years. The changes really have been at the bequest of the special districts associations to try to make sure that the spending of urban renewal is on those things that they think it should be spent on. And so we've put that into the statute and some other requirements on our annual reporting requirements, but nothing on that issue that John spoke to. But I do, I've been doing this for 18 years. I don't know of a circumstance in those 18 years where that kind of issue has come up. And I work with the majority of urban renewal areas across the state. So I do think maybe some things happened long ago, but I don't see them happening now.
Thanks, Elaine. And then Nathan, you did have your hand up. Did someone else ask your question?
Sort of. I think my question really boils down to my trying to interpret Section 48, especially that Shelby was referring to earlier. Because when I was reading that earlier this week, I couldn't quite wrap my head around it based on my understanding of tax increment financing, especially the additional property taxes phrase. So I guess my question, if anything, is when that was written, was it a misunderstanding of tax increment financing? Was it a historical concept that is no longer accurate? Is it a bad faith argument? I just wasn't sure. I was trying to figure out where that came from.
I think part of it is part of it has been fixed. So it used to be, and your downtown area used to take money from general obligation bonds. So if you take urban renewal money out of general obligation bonds, it does mean all of the bond payers have to pay more money because you have a bond payment that has to be paid. You can't give the city of Tigard less money for their GO bond and just hope that they have enough money to pay it. So that did increase property tax bills for everybody. I worked on, and it did pass some legislation in 2009 that changed that provision, that made it so you could no longer take those general obligation bonds or local option levy monies. So that solved that problem. So that might have been what I didn't write that language. I didn't review that language, but that might have partially been what people were talking about. I do think that fire districts, not TVFNR, but some fire districts will say in some of my public meetings, well, you say urban renewal does not raise property taxes, but if you take any of my money, I may have to go out for a larger levy, and therefore it will increase property taxes. So how do you tell people, we don't know if TVFNR will ever raise their levy, so how can we guarantee that urban renewal wouldn't increase property taxes if at some point they feel like their burden's too high and they have to do that?
Thanks, Elaine. Jason, please.
A couple comments, and now I'm losing track of them. It's been so long, but I gotta just, Kim, give you some, maybe we should talk offline, but this format without being able to insert helpful information in the chat, et cetera, I find to be a very disjointed way to be conducting these meetings, especially when people that are sometimes answering the questions don't know nearly as much about things as other members of the group. So I think we may need to rethink that. But Nathan, to one of your points, well, now I've lost it. Let me try to go to, let's see, the ethics discussion. So what would be different from 1983 to now is that a city councilor or mayor, an elected official, would basically have to declare that conflict and then not act on it because it would have personal benefit to them or their direct family. So that's like there's a lot more to the ethics rules. City attorney can certainly speak to this too. And Tigard has been one of the most aggressive even at sort of interpreting and enforcing the ethics rules, but they are, I would say in Oregon, and I will say this publicly, I guess I am now, they're at an extreme point of almost obnoxious, to be honest. Some of the kinds of things that have come out, I mean, at one time in the late 90s, you could only use the internet at lunch if you had the internet at home. I mean, things like that, like it just, even though you could walk over to the library and use the internet, I mean, it was just like really bizarre kinds of things that would come about related to ethics. I don't want to get us all the way into that. Nathan, what was, can you just restate your question? Because I had an important clarification there.
I was just curious about the language around additional property taxes, if that was like a historical concept that was no longer true.
Gotcha. So all of you, I think, will notice a theme in the charter as we go through it, and that is that every section, in my opinion, every section that has been added to the charter by citizen initiative is almost certainly the worst writing we have in the charter. So that would be a theme I would just share with you when you're wondering where and how it got there and why is it read so poorly and whatever. Like in almost every instance, that's going to be because it wasn't something someone that knew what they were doing actually wrote. It was something that a bunch of individuals who may or may not have known what they were doing and or may have had a specific agenda were trying to accomplish in 1983 that is now still in our charter.
Thank you, Jason. And yes, this is a large format with a lot of people and a lot of information. So encourage writing things down. And if you have suggestions for how we can fix this format, happy to talk about it offline. Karen, please.
I have two questions. So the first one, I feel like is just a pointed one that sum up what has been happening here. Without section 48, could the city council impose property taxes on property outside of the urban renewal area to pay for the urban renewal projects? Now, hopefully that's a no.
Elaine, go ahead.
Somebody else want to answer that first? I mean, there seemed to be a question about whether I was giving.
Yes,
I didn't hear the beginning of your sentence while you were muted. What did you say?
Elaine, please continue to answer the question if you wouldn't mind.
Okay. Yeah. If that section of the charter is removed and you have an urban renewal area, which you have two, everybody in the city will continue to have urban renewal as a line item on their property tax bill, whether or not you're within an urban renewal area. That does not mean your property tax bill is increased due to urban renewal. It is simply the way the assessor has to divide out that property tax bill to meet the requirements of measures 47 and 50. The impact of that money that's allocated to urban renewal is on the property taxing districts, not on the property taxpayer.
Thank you, Elaine. Karen, does that answer your question? I think you might have had a second part.
No, that doesn't answer the question because the language says that they could impose additional property taxes on property outside the urban renewal area to pay debts carried out by the plan. So I'm not saying what's on the property tax bill that's weird and misleading. I'm just saying, could something happen where, because I guess it's related to my second question of what happens when there's not enough money to pay the obligation, or if there's too much money that comes in any given year. But without 48, I guess what I'm wondering is, I'm looking at 457 and not finding it readily. Does 457 say that you cannot tax properties outside of the urban renewal to pay for the urban renewal?
And Shelby, do you have context?
Yeah, so I think the short version that you're looking for is no. So under Oregon law, cities cannot impose taxes, period, without a vote of the people, either a local option levy or a general obligation bond. So urban renewal aside, we cannot impose taxes without a vote because our permanent rate is set by law. And that was the measure 5 and 50 that Elaine was talking about. And so in order to increase taxes, so fees are different, rates are different, but taxes, no, not without a vote.
And so what you're saying is even without section 48, the city could not use urban renewal funds to pay for other debt. Or sorry, other way around. Thank you, Karen. Good miming. Okay, so that is correct. Wonderful. So moving on to the discussion portion, we had a couple. Oh, Karen, you had a second part?
I did have the second of what happens if in 1 year, the money that comes in is not enough to pay the obligation, and what happens if there's extra money?
So when 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 an urban renewal agency places an urban renewal bond, they do it through bond counsel. And there's typically something called a debt service coverage ratio. That means for every, and it's usually about 1.5. So that means for every dollar that you have in debt, you have access to $1.50. So if something happened, you will have reserves, and your actual payments will be less than a lot less than the projected amount of revenues that actually come in because of that required debt service coverage ratio. So that was the first part. If you get more money that comes in than covers your debt, Yahoo! And there in urban renewal, you have what's called a maximum indebtedness. We didn't go over that, but that's the total amount of money that you may spend over the life of your urban renewal district on projects, programs, and administration. And you don't have a required duration time period for most urban renewal plans. What you have is that maximum indebtedness. So the faster you get that money in, the sooner your district can end, because it will reach that maximum indebtedness sooner. So if you get more money in a year, that's really good for everybody, because the earlier you spend money, the less amount of inflation has on the costs of your projects. So that's a good thing.
Thanks. And John.
Yeah, I think another point that really hasn't been discussed, and I think it'll help Karen's question, is urban renewal is a separate budget. And so we have a city budget and we have urban renewal budget. City councilors serve as urban renewal agent members. We just put on different hats. And then we're actually president of the urban renewal agency instead of a mayor, and so on and so forth. So we actually have separate meetings. We have separate budgets, separate budget committee. It can be the same budget committee, but it's a whole separate budget, and we discuss it separately. And so can you ever run out of money or not have money or extra money? You can, but I think the extra money was answered. You just do a project sooner than you thought you were going to. But the other thing is, when you're short on money, you just postpone projects. We had lots of projects we wanted to do on Main Street, but due to the recession in 2000, during the multiple recessions we have over the last 20 years, it's actually reduced some of the time frames that we wanted to do those in. And so all it is usually you're budgeting 2 years out, like everything else. You just kick some of those down the road and do them later. And so when you don't get as much or not as much as you thought, that's what happens. You just defer everything till later, because like she said, you have a set amount you can spend, you just don't spend it earlier.
Thank you, John. I think we all got really smart on urban renewal tonight. And Elaine kindly provided a couple of options for us to consider, in addition to any other options that have kind of come to your mind as we've been having this discussion. Tigard currently has those 2 requirements about going to the voters on substantial improvement districts and substantial improvements that have to go back. Gresham is more restrictive. Most cities, if the 241 are much less restrictive, they tend to be in that first column, whereas Tigard would be in that second column, where we could also rewrite, if we wanted to go with that second column and keep those voter restrictions. I would also advocate for maybe redrafting those to be a little more sensible and less outdated, and include more of the meat of the issue. So anyone have thoughts on column A, column B? How are we thinking? Karen, please.
Since we are back on the screen, Elaine, when you talked about column B, I thought I heard you say that you actually switched the increased acreage than what's on the screen, because I thought that the city council one should be a no and the acreage would be a yes, because I thought you said if it was a change for increased acreage or increase the maximum indebtedness. Did I hear that wrong?
Yeah, I'm looking at this, and I think this is correct. It was on to increase acreage, those two.
Those should be reversed.
Oh, I know why I did this. There really should be no reason that this is a recommendation. There is in statute a requirement for a substantial amendment for increasing acreage over 1% of your original acreage. I don't see any reason why that should be something that voters should need to approve. It only costs you money and time, because it doesn't, to me, seem to be the level of scrutiny that would need voter approval. On the maximum indebtedness increase, that is increased money. So if there is a voter concern about the increased money, then okay, that one maybe makes sense to keep. But on the increase of acreage, that was originally put in the statute because of special districts' concern about moving an urban renewal area all over the city and just keeping it going forever and just moving it from one neighborhood to the next neighborhood to the next neighborhood. There are now also limitations on the total amount of acreage that you can change in an urban renewal area. So on this one, my recommendation is if you want to keep voter approval, you might want to consider leaving that out just for an acreage change.
Thank you, Ellen. And Tony, please. Oh, you're muted?
Sorry, I also was bouncing between screens, so I wasn't even on the screen. I think I have a little bit of different past experience, which more mirrors, I guess, what the voters were experiencing in '83, where people have a tendency, when there's money available, to find ways to work with other people and work behind the scenes and not necessarily follow ethics, even when there's ethic rules. And so I'm typically in favor of layers of ethics protection and protection for the money that comes into for these projects, so they don't go to cousins or second cousins or donors or whatever it is in that environment. But so I think I'm more in favor of the transparency of keeping it the way it is, but also what can we look at as a cost benefit analysis too? If we're saving $5,000 by not having a plan go forward, but it's costing us $10,000 to put it to the vote, it's not a benefit to the public. That's a double loss, and I see John, because that's, you don't ever want to quote unquote win and come out with 100% less money. So that's not a win for the population. But so I guess that's kind of, is there a way that we can maybe look and see? I thought I saw a number somewhere. I think it was on the ballot title, where it showed cost the city for ballot measure.
Yes.
So I don't know if that's something that we can use as a reference to see what it's typically costing the city to just ask the question, do the people want this or not in the vote? So I guess that's kind of how my question is, how is this balancing out? I definitely like to see the levels of protection, but at the same time, which of these things might we consider changing? Like Elaine was talking about, maybe some of these things are less relevant on the financial side, that if there's an over burden of bureaucracy and it's costing us money.
Yeah, and that's really the data points that we wanted to share by sharing those ballot measures. Was this is how they have usually fallen out. And John made the point earlier that it's generally 2/3 to 1/3 in approval, and then it costs the city some money. I think Shelby's going to talk to this to put something on the ballot if it's not during a regularly scheduled election. And so that was that cost. That doesn't include the other costs that go along with putting something on the ballot, including polling and campaigning and et cetera, staff time. Shelby, go ahead.
Yeah, so that last point is exactly what I wanted to pick up on. So those costs that we're given is just the cost to actually print the measure on the ballot. So there is significant staff time leading up to that. And it's everything from communications to prepare the materials. It's everything from my time to make sure it complies with state elections law. It's running it through the Secretary of State's office to make sure that they agree that it complies with state elections law. So it is months and months of significant staff time as well across all departments. So those numbers, the dollar figures are just the send the check to Washington County Elections for printing it. There's significant staff time behind it.
Thanks for bringing up that trade-off. Jason, please.
I think frankly, the single biggest cost that we should be talking about is actually the cost and the delay of moving some of these projects forward, which ends up being a really substantial cost. And Tony, I realize if somebody thinks it's the wrong project, then maybe that delay was a good thing. But given our sort of track record in the last 20 plus years, barring one of those 1983 examples, which I'm not sure that this is the right way to solve anyway, like to, keep the language as is, but let's say it was, all the projects that don't have that issue are now being delayed by, I'm going to say at least 9 months. It's probably more like a year. I don't know what Mayor Cook or others would say about the timing, but I would say that the need for the vote, the strategy around that, all the staff time and work and the lead up to it just leads to a much less nimble local government. And people complain about how long it takes to get things done. And this is another one of the contributors to that. Again, I think there does need to be some sort of check and balance, but just recognize that the cost of delays is really significant, especially when you're talking about some of the kinds of projects and the expense of just what something is going to cost 18 months from now versus what it would cost to be doing 3 months from now are significant. And it's been that way. It's particularly acute now in the last 2 or 3 years, but it's been that way even before we got to this current environment. So just be thinking about that as a major cost too.
Thank you, Jason. And Karen, please.
I just wanted to confirm, because we did the debt limit conversation last time. I'm just realizing now that the language used to say specifically for general city purposes, and now the language does not actually say general city. I just wanted to confirm that the maximum indebtedness for a urban renewal is separate and on top of the maximum allowed for general purposes.
Yeah, so Elaine can piggyback. I think if I understand your question, yes. So when we talked about the charter debt limit before, we made it consistent with state law and said that the city's in maximum or the city's debt limit cannot exceed that set forth in law. And that was set forth in, I forget what ORS chapter, but not 457. So yes, the indebtedness of an urban renewal district is something separate and distinct from the general indebtedness set forth in bond law ORS chapter. They're two different things.
Do you have another question, Karen?
I do. So hearing that, I'm leaning towards column B, and I'm intrigued by Beaverton's language about that it is required, and then adding the blurb about a substantial MI amendment would be voted on. And I'm also intrigued with the part where it says that the council is not the whole board, that there would be citizens added to that board.
Interesting. Thanks, Karen. And Zachary, please.
So I just wanted to say, if the I'd like to see more numbers on the actual like cost of like making, voter ballots and sending out to people on like renewal and efforts and big issues, just because I'm not 100% aware of how much debt that's caused in the city in terms of like being a big issue.
So if I can address that. So we're not talking about debt that the city's incurred as a result
no,
of.
no. I'm not saying like debt. I mean like in terms of like loss to the total like income. Like if people were saying, oh, like we were voting on like a policy that'd be like 10,000, and then to like implement or like something, but it would cost like 5,000 or something to send ballots to everyone, and like printing and the expenses of it.
So like we said, the costs that you receive are just the cost of putting it on the ballot. That's what we pay to Washington County Elections. The other costs, the in-kind costs, are hundreds of hours of staff time, and we don't have those numbers. But every piece of mail that you get about the measure, every educational piece, every any information that we respond to, all of that is factored in. So hundreds, if not multiple hundreds of hours of staff time, and we don't have those numbers.
Shall we? Tony, I see your hand, but we haven't heard from Derek tonight. So Derek, please.
Just kind of an open inquiry. Maybe Shelby, you could answer it. And I appreciate the presentation by, I think, Elaine. I think John's contention and Jason's as well is that some of the additional oversight by having a voter sort of referendum on this slows down the business of the city, and I can certainly understand that. John said that the environment has changed as far as mitigating conflicts of interest on the legislative level for like the state of Oregon. Could you speak to that environment? Like, are there sufficient safeguards in place? Do we really need to refer something like this to the voters? And before that, I'm particularly moved by the fact that, right, the voters need to approve an increase in taxation. We're just talking about a redirecting of revenue towards something. So that part's not lost upon me. So but more beyond that, what, I don't know personally myself, if I had something that appeared on the ballot, that I would know how to mentally weigh that, where I could myself determine, oh, hey, I'm sure I'm glad I'm voting on this. I have this ability to mitigate some sort of conflict of interest with a developer or somebody's second cousin. There's no way I'm going to have that information, but I assume that the council might have some insight into that. And so could you speak to that? Just kind of my stream of consciousness here.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so John and Jason are right, is that the ethics laws in Oregon are very strict, and they would absolutely prevent the situation from the 80s from happening again. That said, there are plenty of crimes that are on the books as crimes that still happen. That's why people go to jail for them. And so I guess there
was that issue.
Right. So, we just saw with the OLCC commissioners, that was a violation of ethics laws, and they have been removed from their position and they're facing ethics charges, if not criminal charges. So I guess, just because there's a law doesn't mean that people will always follow it. But yes, the laws are very strong. There are multiple oversight organizations that would be involved in regulating this, both the Secretary of State's office as well as the Oregon Government Ethics Commission. So yes, there are plenty of checks and balances.
Yeah, I think I echo John and Jason in that case. I'm all for government oversight or oversight of government, to the extent that I think other people are in this group as well. But that's the position I'm coming from. It doesn't increase taxes. If we were increasing taxes, it'd be required that we vote on it. In any case, we're talking about special areas or zones where we're diverting tax revenue and I would be in support of letting the business or the city conduct the business of the city, right? I don't necessarily know if I need to be bothered with this. That's just my perspective on it, but thank you.
Thanks, Derek. Okay, so we have two proposals that are currently being echoed right now. One being kind of this column A, we're removing this from the charter, and then the column B, which was going towards Beaverton's language, which I can pull up in a second, which is very minimal and includes a provision that not all urban agency board members are members of the council. And Tony, would you like to speak to that? Tony.
Oh, thank you. I got my unmute going. All right. My question is kind of around that, because this is kind of relates to 48, and making changes to this, I guess, would necessitate changes to 48 because they seem to kind of follow each other. But and maybe I'm incorrect in that, but I do find 48 to be I don't want to knock somebody else's work, but it does seem to be very require a lot of interpretation to say nicely. It's not very straightforward, easy to understand language. So regardless how the rest of this goes, I'm definitely in favor of. I don't know if I guess my question is, would 48 just disappear if we change this, or would we be rewarding that regardless? Because that's my question.
Right. Yeah. So and the group, correct me if I'm wrong, my interpretation is if we go with column A, we are removing 46, 47, 48 completely. And if we go with option B that is currently on the table, we are also removing 46, 47, 48, et cetera, and replacing them with a new drafted, sensible language. Tony, knowing that, did you have a preference between the two columns?
I apologize for my clicking errors. I'm still more in favor of the original going to the voters, but I do understand the positions that other people have, and I respect those positions. I'm just more of an oversight, because if the higher level that we're relying on changes, we would still have this level of protection for the local community that we would otherwise have. And I kind of see this as a little bit of Tigard's culture and its history. So the differences that we have over other cities, I appreciate difference. So that's just kind of how I approach this. But I do understand the other positions, and I understand there's a cost benefit in having all of this moving forward. Putting them on the ballot is not free. So I definitely respect the other positions on this.
Thank you, Tony. And Nathan, please.
So at the risk of muddying the waters a little bit, when I was preparing, I kind of ended up kind of between those two columns, more or less, or one way to think of it would be column A, but with voters approving new plans or new renewal districts, I guess I should say. But between those two columns, I would lean toward column A, I believe.
Great. Thank you. All right, any other thoughts that folks would like to share? So yes, Jason, please.
Sorry, that was just faster than I could do on the computer. I think I would, as I'm thinking about this adding of people that are not necessarily members of the city council, if we're going to entertain that concept, everyone here tonight has experienced how complicated this topic is, and I would suggest that if we're going to do that, that we probably, this is just a proposal for me. I would propose that we use planning commissioners from the city as well to serve in that role, so that they're both knowledgeable about the projects, what the city's trying to achieve, et cetera, and not just have it be a free-for-all of potentially anybody who gets appointed type of thing.
Thank you, Jason. And John, please.
Yeah, I will agree with Jason's workaround on that, but I actually am not in favor of that. The reason being is, if you would look at the city council is accountable to the voters. We have boards and commissions, they're accountable to the city council, who's accountable to the voters. If you allow somebody to make a decision that isn't accountable to the voter, that's where I have a problem. And so I still feel that an urban renewal agency, and I know in Beaverton it happened, you ended up with one of the developers on that urban renewal agency. Well, he ended up being the biggest PIA that Beaverton ever ended up with. And it's, you know, he was pushing projects that only benefited his friends. You know, it just made no sense. And yes, it might have been ethically wrong, but it wasn't wrong under the law because it wasn't his family member. So, I mean, he's not accountable. He wasn't accountable to anybody, and nobody could vote him off. And so I have a problem. I understand, Karen, where you're coming from on that and why people would want that, but I have a problem when it's whoever's making the decision for the taxes or the increased bond indebtedness or anything else is not accountable to the voters. Things can happen that you can't foresee.
Thank you, John. And Jeanette, I saw your hand and I saw it put down.
I was just putting it down before I spoke. I was actually going to make the same point that John made about being held accountable. So I would echo John's comments as well. And, you know, quite frankly, too, somebody's always going to find a workaround. So the 1980s example, that's why they put some of the amendments in there. I think going with the first column makes the most sense. And down the road, we're going to have another example of something that went awry. That's why bills get put in place. So I think at this point, I would agree with John, and then also with the first column as well. Thank you.
Thank you. So I've been doing some real quick editing, and this is where we are with our options right now. So column A would be the plan approved by council, substantial improvements to increase acreage by council, substantial improvements to create maximum indebtedness, council, and board composition be council. In column B, most of the same, except that the voters approve a plan, but everything else goes to council. And then in column C right now, everything plan is approved by voters. Increase to acreage is still by council, but increase to maximum indebtedness by voters, and the board composition would be council plus planning commission. And Jason, please take it away.
I think the council planning commission thing could be applied to any one of these, probably, but I will also, I guess I just wanted to say, since I had proposed that, that's actually not even my preference. I think, like John said, it's a fallback, I guess, position I could potentially live with and support, but I would much prefer that it remain as a really a hand-in-hand work of the council, but in a different form. I did put it forward as an alternative for people to consider, because I just don't want to see the kind of thing John was describing in Beaverton, or, you know, just, I know how difficult this topic is to explain to people and to have the big picture. So I just wanted to be clear that that's not even necessarily my preference, even though I put it forward as something to consider.
Thank you, Jason. Karen, please.
Well, just because I think I'm the only one leaning towards B or C, I wanted to expand on why, because we're talking about the costs. For me, what I'm looking at is we're talking about indebtedness that's based on basically the housing market or property values. And we know the housing market can tank. And if we have engaged in a bond, I know John was saying we're going to do the 2-year out planning thing, but we're going to, at some point, we're going to commit to a bond and we're going to have to pay it. And I guess there's just this discomfort that of the possibility that we wouldn't be able to pay it. It just makes me nervous. So just going to the voters to ask for more money. I know it's not more money, it's a reallocation of money, but it is, the city still is engaging in a loan, even though the taxes are the payment of the loan. They're committing to a loan, and it just makes me nervous.
Thanks, Karen. And Margaret, please.
Yeah. And, you know, I'm kind of looking at all of this, and, you know, I was on a planning commission and for 8 years and so on. And every once in a while we work in tandem with the city council, of course, sometimes we would come up with a recommendation and they would vote it down. But I think column A is the one that, to be honest with you, is almost the least political. And the reason is there have been so many times in Tigard, whether it was in the 80s, 90s, or in the 2000s, that something would come up and it turned, people were voting, I hate to say on untruths, but people would go through and really politicize it, and materials that were going out were not really on the up and up, and they would, turn things into very, very kind of volatile and whatever situations. And I think on something like this, when you've got a council who, no matter what people say, their hearts are in making our city the best and being honest with the voters and honest with the people in Tigard. And so I think believe it or not, I think it takes some of the politics away from it, even though it is a city council. So.
Thanks, Margaret. And
sounds weird, but.
To Jason's point last meeting, we do have several folks who haven't had a chance to speak on this yet tonight. So I'd like to open up the floor to any of you to jump in if you'd like to raise. Yes, Carol, please. Oh, you're muted.
I thought I did it.
Oh, there you go. Oh.
I just wanted to remind everybody that public does have a way to weigh in on this. And I'm pretty sure that there would be public hearings and information going out, and they do listen to what public says. So it's not going to happen in the middle of the night and nobody knows about it. Everyone will be brought along.
Thanks, Carol. And I believe, as Elaine said, that is a requirement of the ORS to host those public hearings. And Zena, please.
So I'm just have a question about the C column, the planning commission. Is this planning commission is particular to the urban renewal, or it's general?
Jason, do you want to talk about the planning commission?
Yeah, so the planning commission is the city's general planning commission, not specific to urban renewal. It's appointed by the council and is probably the most formal board or commission that we have in the city. They have to actually follow the same ethics rules that elected officials have to follow, and they have to go through some of the same training around that. So that's what's intended there, Zena.
Okay.
Yeah, so if I could follow up on that, Planning Commission is actually established by statute. It's a statutory committee that the city appoints. So the membership will include both private community members, representatives from the Real Estate and Development Committee or community, and it can be, I believe by law, there can be one position that doesn't reside in the city. So it's a semi-diverse, but set by statute committee.
We have a member of the planning commission here tonight. Hi, Nathan. Zachary, please.
So where are we going to specifically vote on like these issues? Just like on call or?
Yes, so we're narrowing down to that point. It sounds, and I'll let Tony speak in a second, but it sounds like we're really looking at columns A and C is where I'm hearing the most discussions. I was going to bring up the slide that talks about kind of how this works, but we do need a consensus vote, which with all 11 of our voting members here tonight would be 9 of 11 to approve a recommendation. And then if we don't reach consensus, then we default to what is currently in the charter. And Zachary, please.
Okay, thank you. I was also wondering, there's no other options, it's just these three, like we can't say like in between or anything.
Oh, folks had brought up a lot of in-betweens and made changes.
Yeah, because I was wondering if an issue, like we could do it like issue based, so like we wouldn't have votes on all issues, because like as of now we have votes on like all the plan approved things.
Yeah, I'd say we probably would want to do at most 2 votes one for what goes to the voter in terms of plan substantial amendment, and then another on maybe board composition. But we don't want to fragment it out probably too much, although willing to hear from the rest of the group if you have different thoughts.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, I was just wondering like if we could do votes like on issues where there are enough people that say they want to like weigh in on the issue or something. That way we know that we have like some sort of public notion that, you know, a vote would be good, but only if like the public like actually wants to like vote a lot on the specific issue or like plan, you know?
So I'm sorry, are you suggesting that we put something in the charter instead that says like if there is significant public interest in something, then it goes to the vote, to voters?
Yeah, exactly. That way we're not wasting too much on voter costs, but also being respectful to people in the public who might want to vote on a specific issue.
Yeah, I am
To the point.
not quite sure how that would operationally work, but interested to hear from the group. But thank you for the suggestion, Zachary. And Tony, please.
And I think this might help, or may or may not, because I know kind of earlier on we were talking about the different definitions of substantial and how we're breaking down what substantial, what are these. What does this phrase mean? What is a substantial amendment? How does Tigard define that? This might be a Shelby question. In that language change, to kind of address the concerns about wasting money and wasting, you know, voter time, things that the council could handle and people would have a big issue with, maybe clearly defining what substantial means could make it to where we could make minimal changes on what type of thing goes to the voter, but narrow that down significantly. So substantial actually means something, where substantial, if it's a 50% increase to maximum indebtedness, you know, that's substantial. And clearly defining it that way, if it's something inconsequential, then we're not wasting time. And that would help address Jason and John and that other side of let's let the council do its business.
Right. So Elaine probably has it faster than me. Substantial amendment is defined by statute in ORS 457. Elaine, do you have that handy?
I just have it handy right here. So it's any increase over 1% of the original acreage or any increase in the maximum indebtedness of a plan. And that's defined by statute as what has to be a substantial amendment. And then statute further goes on to say that any substantial amendment has to be approved in the same public process of ORS's adoption of an urban renewal plan. And as I think Carol was saying, that public process is fairly extensive. So it goes to your urban renewal agency, it goes to your planning commission, it's sent out to all taxing districts, it goes to a hearing in front of city council for the non-emergency ordinance. So there is a lot of opportunity for people to provide input at each of those steps.
Okay, so would it, if we were going to keep this, could we make it to where our definition of substantial, since it's over and above ORS 457, could we make it to where it's a substantial increase is double maximum indebtedness or something? Because I concur with the rest of you that to me doesn't seem like so substantial that the council couldn't handle it. So I guess in that context, I'm more in agreement with the council handling it, because 1% of increase in acreage could be a large area that I don't think that needs to go to the vote.
Elaine, please.
There are statutory restrictions on increases in maximum indebtedness. So if you wanted to do something like that, it would be good to understand those statutory restrictions also. So a city council may increase maximum indebtedness by 20% of the original maximum indebtedness as adjusted annually for inflation. They may do that on their own through that whole process that I just talked about. Any increase above that amount, so Tony, you were talking about a big increase, like 50%, has to be approved by 75% of the taxing districts who levy the permanent rate levy. So even though that's not having to be approved by voters, it is a substantial hurdle to get 75% of the taxing districts. So just, I think it's good for you to know that limitation that already exists in the statute.
Thank you. And Zena, please.
So I'm a non-voting member, but I have some thoughts about this simple considerations. Involving voters in all these four things may significantly delay the project. That's what I heard. So I would like voters at least involved in approving the plan so that everybody feels involved.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that? What did you want to do the plan?
So no, I don't, among these options, I don't like voters to be involved in everything so that if that's the case, then it increases it delays the project, but at least voters should be involved in approving plan approval, the first one.
So looking at column B then, where voters are, okay. All right, we have a little, so as far as the voting members of this group, I've only heard column A and C really coming up. So what I would like to do, if this group is ready for that, is to do a vote between these two options, knowing that one option would need to receive 9 votes in order to become this group's recommendation. And that if neither of these options are selected, then we would either need to go back to the drawing board and reconfigure them, or we would default to what is currently in the charter and have no recommendation from this group. Does that, Nathan, please.
I just had a quick question on, are there any limitations, or what are the limitations on how many times we can vote?
We can keep voting, but what we're voting on has to change. So we can't be doing the same vote repeatedly. So things would need to be retooled. And then Jason, I saw you raise your hand.
Yeah, I just would say, I think we would, given how much work we've done so far, which is substantial, but not, I mean, I wouldn't want to be giving up if we don't. I think we have an obligation to work harder at it if we don't get there now. I don't think we just go to defaulting, in my opinion, to the current language, which is terrible.
I agree. And we are ahead of schedule technically by a whole meeting. So we have time to continue this conversation. And Tony, please.
Oh, sorry, I'm actually column B. I was originally column C, but based on the other clarification, I think I'm more column B. So I don't know who else is in that. I kind of
maybe we don't have any column C anymore. Although it sounds like maybe column B, so it's A and B, and then column B should be council plus, given that I just saw Karen's hand go up for column B. So that's what I'm gonna do. And we're gonna be voting between, thank you, Tony, for that. So we're gonna vote between columns A and B from this group. All right, does anyone want to make that motion? Let's do a little bit of Robert's rules. You don't have to raise your hand.
I will. I move that we take a vote on the options that are before us, column A and column B.
Thank you, Margaret. And do we have a second?
Second.
Any discussion? All right, moving on. Derek Lawson.
Column A.
Karen Emerson.
B.
Lindsay Washburn.
A.
Margaret Doherty,
A.
Nathan Jackson,
A.
Tony Simpson,
B.
Zachary Claremont,
A.
Jason Snyder,
A.
Jeanette Shaw,
A.
John Cook,
A.
and Carol Krager.
A.
All right, with a vote of 9-2, column A is the recommendation from this group. Congratulations. So looking at the time, we have 13 minutes left. We are obviously not going to go into high capacity transit, nor are we going to, I think, spend too much time looking at the charter that was already sent out. But I did want to talk to that for just a second with this group. So we sent out that charter shell with articles, I think 6 and 7 that came from our prior discussion. At our next meeting, provided that high capacity transit maybe doesn't go as long as this conversation does. I'm sorry, I did not anticipate that this one would be quite so in-depth, but I really enjoyed the discussion. I hope you all did too. We will go and discuss completely Articles 6 and 7. There was one provision in there that it was highlighted that I said we would discuss during mayoral powers, and that was that the mayor must sign all ordinances. When we talk about elected officials, there are cities with the same form of government as Tigard that do have a mayoral veto in their city charters. So that is something that that was important to discuss before just putting that in the charter as a recommendation from this group. But the other topic I want to discuss is looking at our schedule going forward, and this is going to be preempted by about one meeting given our conversation tonight. However, so we've completed urban renewal tonight. We'll move high capacity transit to that March 13th meeting where we'll also do that review. We may have time to start a form of government conversation, at least with some preliminary presentation. Thank you, Jason, for flagging this to make it very explicit. We will be talking about form of government followed by elected officials. We do have 2 meetings that will be back-to-back weeks because we're trying to avoid spring break. That's that March 13th and that March 20th. So then there will be another long break between March 20th and April 10th. So if you're tracking these on your calendar, just to keep that in mind. We made another switch. Originally, we were going to go from elected officials to city officials to elections process. What we realized putting together the meeting guide around elected officials is it was kind of hard sometimes to differentiate between what was elected officials and what was elections process. One topic that comes to mind would be term limits or even the length of terms. So we're going to talk about that immediately following elected officials and then move on to city officers. A topic that came up in our last meeting that deserves a lot more discussion is how fees, taxes, et cetera, are levied on the city by council. So we will have a full discussion on fees looking to May, and we have some guest speakers that are coming. We've been doing a lot of research into other city charters and how they make those provisions. And we'll also have a discussion about the preamble, something that came up a lot from this group when we were talking in our interviews, and then really in the first meeting was wanting the charter to have some sense of the values of the city. I think that even came up a little bit tonight, and the preamble is one of the best places to put that. So we will have that discussion as well. We do have some unscheduled time still, although that's about to disappear when I redo the schedule, which is why we put it in there in the first place. But any questions on what we can expect going forward? Great. We will be doing breakout rooms. If I had known, to Jason's point, we'll always do the Q&A in the larger group, but we will do discussion for big topics in the smaller rooms. I apologize, we did not anticipate quite what this conversation was going to be tonight, but going forward, we will be using the breakout rooms for all the conversations around form of government, elected officials, elections process, and city officials. And John, please.
Yeah, I just want to commend everybody for the amount of homework that you've done. I mean, the questions that you guys come up with is amazing. I mean, it took me luckily I learned urban renewal early on, but it took a long time for everybody to understand urban renewal, and it's not easy. Let alone, we won't even get into measures 5, 47, and 50 and everything else of how a tax bill works. I mean, there's a lot of comments I wanted to make there, and I bit my tongue a lot. But, you know, the homework you guys do, the questions you come up with, you know, you're reading this code sections, you know, to even, not even just the homework, but you're going off on your own and doing things. And I'm just so impressed by this committee on, you know, maybe everything that I want won't come out the way I want it, but just how the amount of input that everybody's put into it, I'm just overly impressed on that. I really want to commend each of you.
Thanks, John. Yeah, I echo, I see Shelby nodding. This feels like a group that's very respectful of each other's time. And that's so important. Zachary, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to go off what he said. And even if there were some things where I felt like at first I didn't fully understand the concept, I feel like you guys are really quick to kind of jump on with, you know, opinions, and then also how it's like played out to really show the benefits of certain choices over others, which makes it a lot clearer to understand. And I appreciate all of you guys' time, because you probably didn't have to invite a youth representative, but you did by choice, and I appreciate that.
I think Jason helped make that decision to have a youth representative on this group. And Jeanette. And so what you can expect to see from us going forward. So you'll expect to still see those Thursday emails. Obviously all the homework about high capacity transit has already been sent out, but we are developing quite a lot of homework around form of government. And we are still going to try to get all of that out to you this Thursday, knowing that because that break of March 13th to March 20th, we really don't want to hold on to that and force you all to do a lot of reading in 1 week. So you'll get a pretty substantial meeting guide coming out this Thursday. So send me any questions, comments, etc. We got 5 minutes. Any last thoughts? Nathan, please.
I guess I had a bit of a question. I was just curious, we've, in some of our prior meetings at least, we kind of opened up some areas where council could, you know, create ordinances to have a little more freedom than they used to have. Like I'm thinking around when we were talking about the single versus multiple readings of proposed ordinances, that council could say we want to do multiple readings through an ordinance. Are we keeping track of areas where we've opened things up for council, or is this committee going to provide recommendations like which direction we think those ordinances ought to go? Anything like that?
So we are tracking those, and we were planning that these would go in kind of as so all of the recommendations from this group go to council, and so including the ordinance recommendations with that packet. Shelby, please jump in. No, that's good.
Yeah, it'll be, so what I'm envisioning is there'll be two different kind of sets of recommendations. One will be the charter itself, and then the other is a list of things that council can take up on its own should it wish to. So yes, we are tracking those things. The other thing that we're going to have is kind of a legislative history that goes along with the charter. Because in interpreting ambiguous sections under Oregon law, that's something that attorneys and others will look to if there's confusion as to what did the drafters intend by it. And so that is, you know, we heard earlier when it's referred by non-city staff that can complicate the charter in terms of interpretations, and we'll get in that a lot more at the next meeting. So wanting to avoid that, we will definitely have a kind of what the charter committee intended that will accompany the charter itself. So we can note those kind of concerns and stuff in our legislative history.
And all of these recordings become part of our legislative history. So thank you all for a wonderful discussion, a really good conversation, and we will see you all on March 13th to talk about high capacity transit and start our form of government conversation.